I'll wait for the robot to say recording in progress. Good Friday morning, everyone. Happy February. My name is Tim, and I am the host this week at the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Naturalist, which comes to you almost without fail on Friday mornings at 9 a.m. straight to your home or the place you are currently watching from. And normally these episodes had a tradition of focusing on creatures nearby to our backyards. And I think right about season 3, we started stretching the boundaries from, I guess, the typical Wisconsin or Bostonian backyards and moved a little bit beyond that. So that's when Larry suggested we change the tagline to the backyards and beyond. And for this episode, we're going pretty well beyond most of our backyards. We're going to somebody's backyard, I guess anybody that lives on the coast, and we'll find out with a bit of a spoiler that some people listening on the show might be closer than you think to this week's featured organism or group of organisms, the jellyfish. So sit back, relax, sip on something Higa if you can. That's what I'm doing as we bring you episode 22 of season 6 of the Backyard Naturalist, the Old Man of War, and the sea right after. We do a quick shout out to the subscriber community. And pardon me, I just had to make a quick adjustment. You provide resources that keep this journey of learning as a group alive. We are so grateful for your support. We are grateful to everybody that's tuning into this, whether you're here with us on Friday morning or you're watching the recording or listening in your car or listening at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep. Whatever the situation is, we're glad you're here. And the screen in front of you tells you there is a super subscription level, which brings you monthly-ish hikes to local green spaces. And we are here is some evidence that at least some of the people in the first few trips had fun. So we had Moran Sangara lead us through Riverside Park and Eddie Daniel lead us through a really nice stretch of the river along the Menominee River Valley just north of Capitol. And your next chance to be in a photo with lots of people, lots of smiling people, is going to be on February 22nd. So Bill Miller is going to take us to one of his favorite places. I'm not going to reveal the location just yet, but it will be along the coast of Lake Michigan, and it will be south of downtown. So again, a super subscription gives you access to all these excursions, and you can also sign up for them individually if you would like. So moving on to the mysterious, wonderful world of the jellyfish in all their amazing glory. Here it is. Here's the jellyfish. And I think if you or most folks or kids or whatever were to draw a jellyfish, it'd probably draw this something that looks like this: the umbrella top, the tentacles coming down, and I think most people could say they live in the ocean. They can sting you, true and true. But then my mind just goes in so many different places. How and what and why, and we are all looking at probably the oldest lineage of multicellular animals on the entire planet. For many years, we thought it was the sponge, but a lot of recent evidence is saying that likely, and there's a lot of similarities between sponges and jellyfish, but jellyfish and comb jellies are probably the oldest multicellular animals on the planet, starting in the ocean. And oftentimes we will look at something like this, the tree of life. So the phylogenetic relationship of all living things, mainly based on that Linnaean system that's really becoming outdated. But when you take the path of the animal, which starts down that eukaryotic highway in the single-celled organisms, when you get to the multicellular animals, the very first branch off the tree, the very first multicellular animal to break away was likely the ancestral form of the jellyfish. So, sponges and jellyfish are animals, and likely the jellyfish are representing the oldest group of animals. And when we ask how old, it's hard to say without, for a lot of animals, it's you find a fossil embedded in the rock and you can age the rock. But, would that ever happen to a soft-bodied jellyfish? The answer is yes, it will. And so we actually have, for crazy reasons, and how this formed is I guess lucky. It's kind of you have to have just the right uh, situation for a soft-bodied jellyfish to become fossilized, and it did happen. And this happened in a shallow inland sea in Utah. And there's also a lot of really good fossilized jellyfishes in Wisconsin. But the Utah jellyfish dated back to 580 million years. And there's new mitochondrial evidence that jellyfish might go back as far as 740 million years. So that's 200 million years before the Cambrian period, where you just see that first major speciation event. So talking really, really old. This is 450 million years before fish. Predates, then obviously predates the other stuff like dinosaurs. Um, so one of the most amazing things about them and the comb jellies is just how old they are. And there's a bunch of paleontologists that sit around and argue about these things, but it for the most part, evidence is supporting that it's really, really old and doesn't keep us from marveling about them. So if you kind of go back to that grouping, the family grouping, they have a phylum, the Cnidaria, and this is a group of aquatic all invertebrates, mostly found in marine environments. And in addition to jellyfish, this includes hydroids, which is another stinging plant, kind of a cousin to the jellyfish, the sea anemones, the stinging sea anemones, corals, tiny marine parasites. They all have a nervous system, but no centralized network, no centralized brain. And they're all, almost every one of these are stinging organisms too, with these little cnidoblasts, which are these tiny harpoons they use to capture prey. The body plan is pretty simple. It's basically a sandwich. There is an external layer of cells, which is the outer skin called the epidermis. Then there's an inner skin layer called the gastrodermis, which gastrodermis means digestive layer. And then all that stuff in the middle is called the mesoglia, that's the jelly filling of the jellyfish. So when you're eating the jelly in a jelly donut, you're eating the mesoglia of the donut. It's really interesting to note that the inner and outer layers are just one cell thick. So all that jelly in the middle, and that's non-living substances, is that makes up the bulk of this. So it's a tiny, fragile layer of actual living cells bulked up by the goop, which adds a layer of. They're very delicate, but they're survivors. 700 million years old. They reproduce in a lot of different ways. They undergo metamorphosis, 2, sometimes 3 different body forms, and which often has a swimming phase we call the medusa, and then a stationary polyp phase. And radially symmetrical, they have a mouth that isn't really a mouth, it's just an opening. It's the only opening, in fact, in the whole organism. So everything that needs to come in or out of that jellyfish, Tori, comes out through that mouth, the mouth butt, whatever you want to call it. That's the only way in or out. Their basic nervous system does help them to sense things like light. They can swim towards the light, away from the light. It allows them to sense gravity, chemicals, and they prey. They're carnivores. They prey on a lot of different animals, mostly the tiny ones, the plankton, the zooplankton, but sometimes much larger animals. And this group that includes the jellyfish also often has um, uh, groups that are live in symbiosis with them. So dinoflagellates for digestion. In the case of corals, you have the zooxanthellae, and the term cnidaria. This is for Carolyn out and the other word nerds. It's Greek for nettle, which makes sense because nettle stings, and this group of animals stings. And then another quick etymological reference is that from the cnidarians, the jellyfish belong to a clade called the Medusozoa, named after the Greek god Medusa, who is a type of monster called a gorgon, which is a name given to another group of animals in this group, the gorgons. So the term jellyfish has been used for at least a few hundred years, and it has included more groups than just the jellyfish, the comb jellies, which are now in a different phylum, the ctenophores. And I'm reading a book called Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. It's a great book. I just can't finish it because I don't have time. But it talks about fish not being an actual grouping of organisms the way you have birds and other things. So jellyfish are not fish, and there is a colloquial group of animals that we call fish, but from a biological perspective, there aren't. But we name things that are in the ocean after fish. So in addition to jellyfish, there's shellfish and cuttlefish and starfish. None of them are fish, but they live in the ocean, and they don't have backbones. This group of they're not vertebrates even, which I think would be at least one characteristic of what we would think of as fish. And even if the kind of the modern day aquaria and other groups are kind of starting to shy away from that term jellyfish and starting to use the term jellies or sea jellies. And a group of jellyfish is called a smack, sometimes called a smuck, which has to be where the name of the jelly comes from. I can't think of another explanation. Jellyfish, like I said, have two very thin layers of skin filled with that mesoglea, which then makes them about 90 to 95% water. And they have that one kind of central cavity in the middle, the body hole. Because of the way their body structures, they don't need the organs that we need. They don't need a stomach because that whole inner layer, the gastrodermis, is where digestion happens. It's where nutrients are absorbed, and it's also where oxygen is absorbed. So if oxygen and nutrients are all absorbed from that skin, they don't need a stomach, they don't need intestines, they don't need a mouth for chewing, they don't need lungs. There's just kind of that inner chamber. The system makes them extraordinarily efficient at digestion. I think of like snakes as being really efficient digesters. They only have to eat, every once in a while and sometimes a year. They're compared to just about every other organism. Jellyfish are the most efficient extracting energy from the food that they bring in. And they have a very simple nervous system. It's called the nerve net that goes throughout the body. There is no brain. There is no centralized nervous system. And so it probably has, and it makes sense being how old it is. It's the most basic brain-like structure of any multicellular organism. So this nerve net branches out across the epidermis, and like I said, they're able to sense light levels. They have a degree of proprioception. They know if they're upside down or right side up. And there are places where nerves and muscles are concentrated, so that particularly that ring of muscles around the bell that they used in motion in the locomotion. And then in the tentacles, those tentacles can detect prey either if prey brushes up against it, or they can also sense chemicals from the tentacles, and they can reach out for prey too. So straight out of the 1950s science fiction movies I used to watch with my dad, there's also the box jellyfish. And they have eyes. Box jellyfish have eyes, which function. They produce, we think, they produce images. And so there is their lenses and retinas, and sometimes there's multiple eyes that look eerily human-like. So this, if you look on this eye on the upper right-hand corner, it it, it looks human-like. It's got multiple eyes, and it just makes it so absolutely crazy because there's no brain, which raises the question, how do you process those images? How do they process? How do they respond to those images? Is it, but it's got to be kind of direct eye to motion, and with no decision making part of it. Um, there is a concentration of nerves called the nerve ring that might play a part of that. But scientists are absolutely baffled by this system of complex eyes with no apparent processing center, which brings up a couple of things for me. Is one is like we just don't understand that animals are just so much more complex than we will ever begin to understand, and we're always just being surprised. And then it raises the questions about consciousness and sentience. Um, but this also must be where we get at least some of the ideas for these sci-fi monsters like Cthulhu. Um, but they have eyes, which is creepy because they're so deadly, partly. Um, in addition to being extremely efficient digesters, jellyfish are extremely efficient at locomotion. So the amount of energy that they produce to move is very, very low. If you're looking at miles per gallon or whatever, part of it has to do with their body plan. And so when you see them in real life or in aquarium or on TV, you just that mesmerizing contracting of the bell muscle. The contraction produces thrust in the water, and it also produces a vortex called the start vortex. Then when they relax those muscles and the bell kind of expands, it creates a second vortex that basically produces a glide. It's like when you try to bike behind a truck or something to get that drift. It produces its own, and so it's one of the most efficient, at moving around of any animal. In fact, there's researchers at Virginia Tech that are studying this, and they've built a giant jellyfish robot named Cyro to try to see if they can create a boat or submarine that is as efficient as a swimmer as the jellyfish. So really good at digesting, really good at moving, um, and then so much of what we know or we're familiar with is when we see that form that been showing the Medusa, the umbrella form. But that is only one of two or sometimes three major life forms in the jellyfish. And so it's a very complex and elegant life cycle. And so you have fertilization, sexual fertilization that usually takes place in the Medusa stage. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you have a group spawn. So some individuals release eggs, some release sperm. Sometimes it's hermaphroditic. And like a lot of animals, the sperm and egg, if they're all in the same place and responding to the same tidal conditions and moon conditions, then you have a good chance that there's going to be a lot of fertilization. But some species, the females keep their eggs inside that internal cavity, and the sperm that's released in the surrounding environment just kind of swim into that mouth and into the cavity for fertilization, and then it provides at least for a little while, a protective place for the eggs to develop. And some jellies, like the moon jellies, they have little protective chambers in their tentacles that they're so that the eggs can develop with some safety too. So there is a little bit of that kind of parent care, at least early on. So then when the eggs hatch, you have these floating larval stages, and that's kind of the bottom one, starting with 1, 2, and 3, these floating larvae. And they can be in that stage for quite a while, floating around, but then eventually they attach to something. Usually it's the bottom of the ocean, but it can be other things. It can be man-made things. It can be sand, it can be other animals, rarely other animals, but usually they kind of float down and find a good place um, to settle and attach to a substrate. And so then that's called the polyp stage. And the polyp stage is kind of an upside down medusa with the mouth being on top, the cavity on top, and then the tentacles facing upward. And they can be in the stage for years. And then eventually the polyps will breed through a couple processes. So it's usually an asexual budding. And then those buds will become adult medusa. There's so many variations and added steps and skipped steps to this depending on species. There's almost as many different variations as there are species. Some individuals spend much more time in the polyp stage. Sometimes polyps can produce more polyps. Sometimes polyps can produce medusa. So there's just a fascinating different life history for just about every group of jellies. The polyp stage is probably the more dominant stage throughout the group, even though it's less familiar to us. And they look a little bit more like plants or like flowers. Um, they they will sometimes, and we see this back in the past. Let me go back to this slide. So number 11, you see a polyp which is producing these medusas. That process is called strobilation. And sometimes that can happen very rapidly, and someone likened it to like those clay pigeons that are shot off. You get a whole stack of them that start to come off pretty rapidly. Um, so they can stay as a polyp for a long time. They can move back and forth. It's not an orderly progression. Um, Sometimes they're alone. Sometimes they're in colonies. They tend to be very, very small, which is another reason we probably don't think of this stage as much. They can even be microscopic. So that brings an interesting comparison in the jellyfish world, which is the range in size. So you have potentially teeny, teeny, tiny polyps or even medusa that you could only see with a microscope. And then you have this beast. This is the lion's mane. This is not photo doctored, photoshopped. It is in its medusa form. The average size of the bell across the bell is 6 feet wide. So it could easily eat most of us. It's and that's the average size. So they get bigger than this. And the average tentacle can be 50 feet long or bigger. So the bigger you are, the more you can eat. Again, they're all carnivorous, but when you're this big, you can eat just about anything. And if you assume that this diver is maybe, I don't know, let's just assume they're 5.5 feet or 6 feet, you can see just how big those lion's manes get. There are about 10,000 species of Cnidaria and 4,000. So the jellies are the Cnidaria. Then you have a group within the jellies that are called the true jellies, and these are probably the most common that we think of in just kind of the regular jellyfish that we would draw. They spend most of their life cycle in the medusa stage. And then you have a group called the hydrozoa, which tend to spend most of their lives as polyps. They're kind of the opposite. In fact, this hydra here never actually reaches the medusa stage. That's pretty uncommon. They usually go through the stages to one degree or another. So some will spend a lot of time in this stage. Other species will spend a lot of time in the medusa stage. But then you have what are called colonial siphonophores. And this is a colony of individuals, a colony of individual organisms, but then they create something bigger, which goes back to the super weird sci-fi fodder. So as a kid, I watched a show called Voltron. And in Voltron, there were 5 superheroes, and each controlled separate robots that were like, I don't know, Panther robots. And, alone, separately, they could do a lot of good things. But when they really needed strength, when they really were in a dire situation, each of these five robots could form together to call Voltron, which is just a super mega robot. This is maybe the best illustration of what happens in another very famous jellyfish, which is the Portuguese man of war, which can get really big. It's not technically an organism, it's a colony of organisms, and each organism has a specified role. So, one or a group of organisms will be just in charge of digestion, another will be in charge of catching prey, another will be in charge of locomotion, another might be in charge of reproduction. It would be as if each of your organs in your body were made up of separate living creatures working together. So your heart is what is its own thing, your lungs are another thing, your brain is their other thing. And I can't even wrap my head about how it works. It is Voltron, and each of the organisms are genetically identical. They come from the same egg through asexual budding. Technically speaking, it's a colonial organism made up of zooids, which are single animals, because unlike Voltron, the organisms couldn't live without each other. So they're dependent on each other. So they're not technically like separate living beings coming together like Voltron, but in a way they are, because they're producing, they're budding, they're reproducing, and each of those new organisms kind of comes together to create the superorganism. And again, they rely on each other, they're connected, but that's nuts. If we revisit the box jellyfish, I think the box jellyfish are in a group called the Cubozoa, so named because their bell is more cube-shaped. And we've already talked about their crazy eyes, which are already staring at us right now, and potentially more complex nervous systems. This one is particularly camouflaged, so the eyes don't stand out as much, which makes it even more dangerous because of their toxicity. So this particular one we're looking at is the sea wasp, and has, we think, the most powerful venom of any animal we know of, at least in relation to humans. The most toxic organism out there, worse than any snake or spider or conefish or any cone snail or anything. And yeah, people die from it. It can be very, very, very dangerous and a terrible way to go. The last major group of jellyfish is the Storozoa, which are basically the stalked jellyfish. They're found in colder water and they're always attached to something. So just crazy the amount of diversity, the amount of systems that happen. And speaking of colder water, there is, right outside our backyards in Lake Michigan, a thriving population of jellyfish. They weren't always here. They were introduced from China via England. This is the peach blossom jellyfish, taken from a lake that some of us know of already, Trout Lake up in northern Wisconsin, a lake that I've swam in, a lake that I know some of us on this call have swam in before, and they've got jellyfish in them. And we'll take a quick peek in a video at the end of this of the jellyfish in Trout Lake. So they're invasive. They're in all the Great Lakes. They're in the tributaries. They're everywhere. They're about the size of a penny, and too small to have any effect on humans, which is probably why we don't really know about them or care about them that much. So it's still carnivorous. It still impacts the ecosystem, and jellyfish around the world are having some major impacts because of human changes. And so this one up in Trout Lake is probably just eating plankton, and just, again, doesn't have enough kick to get to hurt us. There are a lot of things that eat jellyfish. So you have a sunfish creeping up on a jellyfish over here. You have fish. Leatherback sea turtles are, sunfish are notorious for loving jellyfish. And then you have the modern day problem of floating plastic bags that are easily mistaken for jellyfish. Jellyfish are a big food for so many marine organisms and freshwater organisms, and then they end up in the stomachs of turtles or fish. They're eaten by other predators. The problem moves up the food chain. It's one of the many big things we have to worry about. And then there's another animal that has developed an increasing hankering for jellyfish over the years, which is human beings. And you can see the demand, particularly in Southeast Asia, has grown, and you got over 420,000 tons in a year in some areas. But it's been harvested by humans for, 1,600 years at least. And I would imagine if it's prepared well, it's probably delicious. I don't know. I don't know if I've ever eaten it in or not, but I haven't intentionally eaten it, but I would certainly try it if it's harvested sustainably. Um, I wouldn't try to want to try to catch them on my own. So one of the adaptations that jellyfish use for defense is camouflage, not quite at the octopus level from a while back, but they do take advantage of where they are in their camouflage. So if it's a jellyfish near the surface, they would benefit from being mostly clear and blending into the water. But if they're spending more of their time on the bottom, they might blend in green with the surrounding vegetation. And then the animals that live deep in the deep seas tend to be red, have a red pigment, because in that low light atmosphere, red basically acts as if it were black and really allows it to hide from predators and from prey. And then the other major form of defense that is those venom-bearing harpoons. They're known as pneumatocysts. So the mechanism of this venom-injecting system triggers in 700 nanoseconds. 700 nanoseconds from the trigger to the injection. 700 nanoseconds is 700 billionths of a second. So very fast. One of the fastest processes in all of the animal world, absolutely faster than blinking your eye, faster than most reflexes. In most cases, this is an annoyance to humans. I've swam in areas where it's like, ouch, that was a jellyfish. Most of the cases you don't feel it, but then there are the really, really dangerous ones. So we've talked about the box jellyfish. There might be an even more insidious and upcoming bad guy, bad person in the jellyfish world. It's a lesser known terror. It's about the size of a peanut, not the with the shell, the peanut, the actual peanut, or the size of a thumbnail, and it's called the Irukandji jellyfish. So in Southeast, in kind of Oceania, New Zealand, Australia area, one sting from one tentacle of this jellyfish produces the onset of what's called Irukandji syndrome. This, according to the Stuff You Should Know, has, for those who have stung and survived, and somebody did this on purpose. They wanted, like, you have those crazy folks that really just want to, like, oh, what does it feel like to get bit by a bullet ant or things like that. So somebody did this on purpose. They wanted to know what it was like. Those who have been stung and survived report, and this person did, the the first symptom to appear is extreme back pain, and they say it's like somebody's hitting your kidney with a baseball bat. Then that's followed by a period of nausea and vomiting about once a minute for 12 hours. You can imagine how fun that is. That's followed by spasms in the extremities, increased blood pressure, the sense of skin creeps, which is like there's worms burrowing in your skin and makes you nuts. One person said it felt like acid was being poured over their body, and the victims are reported to have this overwhelming, impending sense of doom, so much so that it often results in begging whoever's taking care of you, the doctor, to basically say, kill me. I can't deal with this. So really, really crazy, and something that I would never want to experience. Straight up sci-fi horror again. And unfortunately for us, this group of jellyfish is spreading. So it's now found in South Africa. It's found off the coast of Florida. Also, the PSA is just don't pee on a jellyfish sting. It doesn't help. In fact, it could make it worse. So if there are still stingers on your skin, because you probably got more than one, it could activate them. Peeing on it could activate it and make it worse. But a lot of people, like, it's the warm sensation that maybe has a sense of soothing for a minute. So what you want to do is you want to pour seawater over the sting, because the seawater has the same concentration of salt that keeps those harpoons from going. If a jellyfish is dead, it can still sting you. Those harpoons still work from a mechanical way. So even if the jellyfish is long gone, those stingers that are still on your skin can still be triggered, and you might trigger them if you pee on it. So you want to rinse the area with salt water, and then take a credit card, just like we would a bee sting, and scrape off the area. Definitely keep sand out if you can. I'm fortunate to have not saying this from experience. Some jellyfish are bioluminescent, and the thought here is a twofold. One is that by turning on that bioluminescence, it would potentially scare a predator and allow you to get away. Another really cool study is suggesting that by turning on its bioluminescence, it's attracting a predator of your predator. So a bigger predator is going to come along, attracted to your bioluminescence, and then eat the thing that's going to eat you. So, and then even a cooler step, the jellyfish that eat the bioluminescent jellyfish will often produce a red pigment, which again really hides things in the deep water, in that inner chamber to block the light of their prey, so that those jellyfish that they just eat can't glow through their skin and attract those bigger predators to them. So you couldn't design a system better than this in the back and forth predator prey interactions. And this is all from this lowly jellyfish. And then some jellyfish just don't know how to die. So this is Turritopsis nutricola, also known as the immortal jellyfish. It's a hydrozoan, and it can actually revert back from the medusa stage to the polyp stage and essentially live forever. It's found the foundation of youth, or the fountain of youth, that has been sought after by humans. And the again, the same organism can in theory live forever. The process is transdifferentiation, and it could go back and forth until something else kills it. So that would be, the only reason that it could die. There is another species that even seems crazier to me. As it disintegrates, some of its cells will immediately start to reform a new individual cell. And this, this is, I guess it's like the phoenix rising out of the ashes, but the science fiction movies where you kill something, but then everything just kind of comes back together. There's a jellyfish that does that the cells that disintegrate start to immediately form a new individual without any kind of reproduction on the spot, is fertilizing itself. That really makes me think of, like, what does it mean to have sentience? Like, is that jellyfish that reforms the same jellyfish? It dies if it starts to come apart and then reforms. So there's something else going on in there. Maybe it's that kind of superorganism where the cells are programmed to do things apart from the individual. But again, it's not budding, it's not asexual reproduction, it's like frickin' regeneration, which is absolutely nuts. Jellyfish populations around the world are changing. There's likely, based on human activities, unlike climate change, there is still some debate as to what degree humans are causing it, but there are jellyfish population blooms, population explosions, and just from a practical perspective, they can interfere with fisheries, they can interfere with power plants. They've caused power outages around the world. The nuclear sub, the USS Ronald Reagan, had to shut down after jellyfish were sucked into its cooling system. And so there are certainly issues that we have to deal with. And there's a few explanations as to what we humans could be doing to cause this. So overfishing, when you overfish an area, you are taking away the jellyfish's main competition. The fisher people are not capturing the jellyfish, and the jellyfish are like, hey, that's more food for us. Thanks for getting rid of our competitors. Another big issue is fertilization, like crop fertilization, nitrogen, phosphorus, that when they run into the sea, they cause algal blooms. The algal blooms depletes the oxygen. That's bad for fish, but remember how super efficient jellyfish are in their metabolism. They're fine. They're totally fine in these low oxygen environments. And then they're again like, yeah, that's sweet. That's more food for us. The fish are dying. Climate change itself is undoubtedly affecting jellyfish. The increase in temperature, the increase in acidity, and for many jellyfish species, this is helping them. And then we're just from a straight up practical physical process, we're putting more man-made structures into the organism, and a lot of these jellyfish, kind of like the mussels, the zebra mussels, they need something to attach to, and we're giving them more things to attach to. So we're basically allowing jellyfish to spread by putting more stuff in the ocean. So maybe the demise of humans leads to the age of jellyfish in the water and cockroaches on land. There is a jellyfish called the sea walnut that was released in 1982, a great year, the Black Sea. 20 years later, so it was released as ballast from a boat. You know, they try to balance their cargo. And 20 years after it was released, the total biomass of sea walnut in the Black Sea was 10 times the biomass of all of the fish taken by all the commercial fish operations from all of the world's oceans. 10 times. That's how quickly this invasive species spread. And then from a stroke of dumb luck, another ship later released some ballast that had a predator of the sea walnut, which helped to start to control it. But yeah, that was not planned. And there is a group that I didn't talk about. This is the comb jellies. And so for a long time, the comb jellies were grouped with the jellyfish as being closely related, but now taxonomists are realizing they're a completely different group. This could be the oldest group. You mentioned that the jellyfish might be the oldest. They actually, this group might even be older than the jellyfish. So, I was saying that jellyfish could be the oldest group. It actually might be this group of comb jellies, but they are related to jellyfish. They just had a long time to differentiate. So a lot of the things that I mentioned about jellyfish are also true for comb jellies. The only major difference is their movement is through cilia. So they have these rows of cilia that go down, and you've probably seen that where it looks like they're glowing, and you see the kind of rainbow iridescence move down their skin because they're not moving like the jellyfish with the big bell. And so they are the largest animal to use cilia for locomotion. Most of them are unicellular. And then the other big difference is that the comb jellies don't sting you. They don't have venom, they don't have harpoons, but instead they have a very effective sticky substance on their what do you call them? The arms that go out, the tentacles. And so they use those to grab fish instead of injecting them with venom. So that's the two major differences between the groups. There's only about 100 to 150 species of comb jellies, and they tend to prefer slightly warmer water. So lots of stories, lots more stories. We'll end with the legendary Frank Zappa. Frank was quoted as saying, "There is nothing I'd like better than having a jellyfish named after me." And then years later, he got his wish. There is a jellyfish called Phialella zappi, and they've been to space. They're used quite a bit in medicine. Their stories are as crazy as they are unbelievable. And this is where I will end. So thanks for joining today. I will stop sharing my screen.